Welcome back to our channel, folks. Today, we have something truly exciting in store for you. Today I will tell you about the Alphabet Killer. The Alphabet Killer was a serial killer who operated in Rochester, New York in the late 1970s. The killer was responsible for the murders of 3 young girls between 1971 and 1973, all of whom had first and last names that began with the same letter. The victims were Carmen Colon, Wanda Wakovic, and Michelle Maenza. The case of the Alphabet Killer is one of the most baffling and disturbing unsolved crimes in American history. Despite numerous investigations, arrests, and suspects over the years, the killer has never been identified or brought to justice. The first victim of the Alphabet Killer was Carmen Colon, a 10-year-old girl who disappeared on November 16, 1971. Her body was found 2 days later in a vacant lot near her home. She had been strangled and sexually assaulted. Less than a year later, on August 4, 1972, the killer struck again. This time his victim was Wanda Wakovic, an 11-year-old girl who disappeared while walking home from a friend's house. Her body was found 6 months later in a rural area outside of Rochester. She had also been strangled and sexually assaulted. The third and final victim of the Alphabet Killer was Michelle Maenza, an 11-year-old girl who disappeared on November 26, 1973. Her body was found 2 weeks later in a ditch near a rural road outside of Rochester. She had been strangled and sexually assaulted. All 3 victims had similar profiles. They were young girls who had been sexually assaulted and strangled, and their first and last names began with the same letter. This led investigators to believe that the killer had a specific pattern or motive for choosing his victims. The investigation into the Alphabet Killer case was one of the largest and most intensive in New York State history. Police interviewed thousands of people, searched hundreds of homes and vehicles, and conducted numerous forensic tests and analyses. Despite these efforts, the killer was never caught. Over the years, there have been several suspects and leads in the case, but none have led to a definitive identification or conviction. One of the most notable suspects in the Alphabet Killer case was Kenneth Bianchi, one of the infamous Hillside Stranglers, who terrorized Los Angeles in the late 1970s. Bianchi was arrested in 1979 and eventually convicted of murdering 10 women and girls in California. During his trial, Bianchi claimed that he had also committed the Alphabet murders in Rochester. However, investigators were unable to find any conclusive evidence linking Bianchi to the crimes, and he was never charged or convicted in connection with them. Another suspect in the case was Joseph Nasso, a serial killer who was convicted of murdering 4 women in California between 1977 and 1994. Nasso was known for targeting young women and girls, and his crimes bore some similarities to those of the Alphabet Killer. In 2011, Nasso was arrested and charged with the Alphabet murders. However, he was never formally charged with the crimes, as prosecutors were unable to find sufficient evidence to link him to the killings. Despite the lack of progress in the case, the Alphabet Killer remains one of the most notorious and haunting unsolved crimes in American history. The killer's identity and motives remain a mystery, and the families of the victims continue to seek justice and closure after more than 4 decades. Thank you for tuning in, and we can't wait to see you in our next video. Until then, stay curious, stay inspired, and keep exploring.